Good afternoon or good evening to everyone, or not sure if anyone's here in the morning. I am Adam Lupel, acting president of the International Peace Institute, speaking to you from New York. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone to this book launch of Architectures of Violence, the Command Structures of Modern Mass Atrocities by Kate Ferguson. I have I'm lucky enough to have a copy here. When I spoke to Kate last week in preparations for this event, she lamented that COVID meant we wouldn't be having a traditional friendly book launch where we could gather with wine and maybe some cubes of cheese. But I think, as has become the norm over the last year, doing this by Zoom allows us to engage a much larger audience near and far, and so that's really great, and that's really what has happened. As I've been asked to explain, because of the large number who have indeed signed up, we've organized this as a webinar as opposed to sort of a virtual seminar. But we still hope to make this as much of an informal conversation with plenty of time for Q&A at the end. The event is being recorded and shared by Protection Approaches via their YouTube channel. So do feel free to share and interact on Twitter and elsewhere. There is a lot to engage with on this very smart and impeccably researched book, which I highly recommend. Architectures of Violence at its base is a book of history about the wars of the 1990s precipitated by the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, with fascinating details and insights about the involvement of paramilitary and irregular forces in the atrocities and mass violence of the times, and engaging narrative arcs about some of the personalities at the center of it all. But it is a history situated in a conceptual frame that reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics of mass violence and how they work, which is not time-bound to the 1990s, nor geographically specific to the Balkans. Indeed, the argument of Architectures of Violence poses tough questions about how we understand the prevention of mass atrocities, the protection of civilians, and the accountability of perpetrators in a variety of contexts today, from Syria to Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, and beyond. Indeed, this is the best kind of history with important lessons for our current times, which I hope we will cover in depth later in our discussion. But I'm going to leave it to the author to tell you more about the book. Kate Ferguson is a foreign policy expert specializing in the prevention of identity-based violence and mass atrocities. In 2014, she co-founded Protection Approaches, where she is co-executive director and leads research and policy programs. She is also chair of policy at the European Center for the Responsibility to Protect. We are also fortunate to have with us as a distinguished discussant, Emily Winterbotham. Emily is Director, Terrorism and Conflict and Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, as we all know it, where she focuses on extremism and radicalization, countering violent extremism, and peace building. She has over 10 years desk and field experience in an international policy-making environment and is a deployable civilian expert for the UK government's stabilization unit. I will first turn to Kate with a couple of general questions to get us started. Then we will hear further reflections from Emily before we move to the Q&A. I encourage everyone in the audience, as you're listening, if you want to submit questions, to submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I think at this point we're all sort of Zoom literate. But when you submit your questions, please include your name, affiliation, and where you're listening, watching from. And after our remarks, I'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So, Kate, this is your show. Congratulations on the excellent book. It's really exciting. why don't you just start by telling us a bit about the origins of this research? And I know it's been in the works for some time, as is really evident by the really rich detail and extensive research. Please.
Oh, thank you so much, Adam. Oh, and just thanks so much for everyone who's joining. I'm just seeing names just joining all of the time, and many, many familiar ones. And just thanks for making some time to join. As Adam says, I wish we were all together and having a glass of wine, but that would almost certainly mean that many of you couldn't be here. And there's something wonderful about having such a global conversation with so many friends and colleagues, even if we can't see you. We so much appreciate you being here. And thanks so much to Adam and Emily for agreeing to be part of this conversation. It's certainly been some time in the making. Many people on this call have heard me talk about this book for so long that I'm sure they imagined it was not real. I thought I'd start by maybe sharing a couple of things that triggered this book. And there are a couple of things that I talk about in the prologue of the book. So those of you who are super keen, who've already bought it, already read it, apologies. But it's really kind of, I think, the origin of where I thought this story needed to be told. The first was that I read an article by the journalist Tim Judah, written in 1992. And so this was during the height of the systematic, well-planned and strategic violent campaign to intentionally remove Bosnian Muslims and other non-Serb minorities from certain areas in Bosnia. And Judah wrote in the Times that war was being waged by a kaleidoscope of militia, armies, and freelance groups. Accurate numbers are impossible to ascertain, loyalties overlap, and who really controls whom, if anyone, is a moot point. And so I knew that this was a common conceptualization of the Bosnian crisis and of what happened in Yugoslavia during those years more broadly. But it definitely didn't reflect the reality of the situation of what was going on. And it's also something that I think it's a really common way that you see in the press and in foreign correspondence and commentary to describe situations where civilians are being targeted. And the focus, perhaps really understandably, is very often on the outcomes of that violence and the humanitarian and the human suffering, rather than the kind of awful logic of that violence. And I suppose I've always thought that if you want to prevent those crimes, or if you need to find ways to halt them, then you really need to sort of look into the shadows. And I've always been interested at looking at kind of the histories and processes that bring perpetrators or ordinary people often to kind of commit these awful acts. The second trigger was a conversation I had, I think it was 2010, with a former senior frontbench MP who had really been at the centre of the UK's Bosnia policy. And he told me when I was interviewing him about the UK's Bosnia policy and why the government made the decisions that it did. And he told me that the presence of what they saw to be non-state combatants had inhibited British support for a more assertive, protective response. And he argued that it had been impossible for the UK government to determine which forces were committing what atrocity, or to identify who, if anyone, was in command. So it was exactly the same analysis that Tim Judah gave. Now, this was reinforced with some understandings, or rather some misunderstandings, about Yugoslav and Western Balkan history. And he talked about the sense that the British cabinet, the British political leadership had an appreciation for what they described as like Yugoslavs' paramilitary aptitude in the Second World War. Like, these are a people that are really good at paramilitary warfare. Therefore, that's what's going on here. This is coming from communities, not coming from political command. Now, like, whether or not this is actually what the British government believed, or whether it was their public explanation for a failed policy to protect people. I think that what became really clear to me is that determining who is commanding what perpetrators is absolutely far from moot. And that has implications for prevention, for protection, and also for prosecution. I think that if proper attention had been paid to who was commanding who during the early experiences of what happened in Syria, I think the world would at the very least have been better prepared to foresee and therefore prepare for the trajectory of violence there. I think that looking through the tragedy of Syria through the eyes of the story of Bosnia, it was too easy to see the direction of travel, like not just of the violence, but also of how the international community would respond. And I suppose really the driving kind of cause of this work or this book, and of all of the work I think I do, is that I believe that mass atrocities and identity-based violence pose some of the greatest contemporary threats to global and human security and stability, and that they're becoming more frequent and more likely, not less so. And that was just proved when I was writing this book, that the Myanmar army and its armed auxiliaries committed coordinated atrocities against the country's Rohingya minority in Rakhine. It was described very quickly as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. I describe it as genocide. This was predictable. But I do think that the failure to identify those covert structures of violence that the state and the Tatmadaw were investing in, the failure to look at how the dynamics of smuggling and organized crime and corruption in the country played a part in that trajectory, contributed to that collective failure to identify the full scale of the risk. So I think that that's where this book came from. And unfortunately, as I was writing it, to me, it only became more evident that this was an area of study that we need. I guess I'll just end by measuring some expectations. This doesn't promise any kind of big answers. I'm not saying that if only we can map out who's who and track the money and track the political strategy, that somehow we will reveal some kind of like hitherto unknown answer of prevention. But I do think that there's a dimension of contemporary mass violence that just we don't look at. And whether we're looking from a legal perspective of how to prosecute foot soldiers versus like those that are most responsible, whether we're looking at how we can interrupt the pathways that lead to armed violence, and also look at kind of those wider areas of kind of social culpability, criminal culpability, organized crime, that kind of mess, then we're still understanding mass atrocities through too narrow a framework. So that's kind of where it came from. That was my bold ambition, but I promise no new answers.
Oh, there's a lot of nuances there, and actually, I mean, the follow-up question to the origin was, of course, questions related to the relevance to today, which I think you've already answered. I mean, this is a history book, but it provides us some insight on questions related to how to prevent in the future, how to protect in the current context, but also then to hold people accountable for past actions. And I'm wondering, maybe before we move to Emily, if you could, would you maybe want to share some of the details from the Balkan case that you think are particularly relevant to some of these current lessons? I mean, there's so much rich detail here, and that is really the bulk of the book, and really very well researched and well written.
Thank you. I so appreciate that's generous of you to say, Adam. I think like some of the details and the lessons that I think are really applicable. Like one is just the kind of the act of mapping who's who. I mean, I really think it is an under-resourced tool when we're talking about understanding and even preventing or responding to these crimes. You know, sort of if you map who's who, and I don't mean in a kind of necessarily like traditional military understanding of where people are in the field, but actually sort of where they're receiving their money from, and what the relationships are. I think that is a really useful exercise that shows just how many entry points there are to understanding how modern mass atrocities are perpetrated. Because what that does is that it shows where those points of influence are. And very often those points of influence aren't necessarily the kind of most ideologically extreme. They're kind of often there for strategic reasons. They think that there's going to be a kind of opportunity of power or resource. And from a prevention perspective, if you're able to identify that layout and cut them off, if you can stop people receiving their money, receiving their arms, then you've done it in a way that is kind of evidence-based, but not going on the assumption that you need to respond in kind. And if that's a paramilitary structure, then we need to, you know, those that want to prevent need to have a paramilitary structure to respond. I don't hold with that, but then, I mean, maybe I would. I'm a human rights activist, not a defense expert. And more broadly related to that, though, is the field of organized crime. I increasingly think that we should be looking at mass atrocity crimes as a form of contemporary organized crime. Almost always, genocide is about stripping communities from what they have. And it is very often about sort of property and power. If you look at what happened in you know, the Armenian genocide, there was a kind of stripping of property, power, and money. That happened in Bosnia. It's happening in Rakhine, and the framework of organized crime, in some ways, is more, or how we respond to it, is more developed than atrocity prevention, and it's also rooted in an understanding of logic. And our approaches to contemporary mass atrocity crimes is often one of emotion. We feel so devastated for the human impact that we don't necessarily look at the logic of the violence. We look at the devastating consequences. So for me, those are the really big ones. And maybe the third is looking at the social impact. What you see in former Yugoslavia, but this is not exceptional to that context at all, is that when you have violence where the lines between enemy and civilian, sometimes neighbor and enemy, are blurred, you often have armed combatants that are operating within the same sphere that their family live. And so you don't go off to battle and come back several years later. You often come back at night and sleep in that bed. And so understanding those family dynamics, those social dynamics, the passive support, the active support that is given to campaigns of genocide and ethnic cleansing, I don't think is a part of our understanding of how to interrupt those processes.
Thank you. That's one of the most interesting lines that I read in the book that relates to this last point is you characterize much of this violence as both, it's a social phenomenon, but also a military strategy, and trying to understand where those intersect, where that element of social phenomenon with the intentional military strategy component, I think gets at really at the core of the puzzle that needs to be solved in order to best prevent and protect in the future. Great. So let's give Emily a chance to chime in here. I think some of these points about organized crime and other kinds of actors are quite relevant to her work. Emily, why don't you give us your reflections, and maybe you can also pose a question to Kate before we move to the general Q&A. Emily, please.
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much, Kate, for asking me to be part of this. It's such a nice opportunity, actually. In fact, that we've the fact that it's online, that I can actually join, because I'm currently on parental leave, and I fear that I would not have been able to join with wine and cheese if it had been in normal times. But I'm also grateful for my copy, which I don't think we can see very well through the Rusi library. And I'd just really like to congratulate you, Kate. I mean, it's an immensely detailed read in terms of what was happening in the former Yugoslavia, which has, really such a simple message actually for other conflicts, which is, when you look at these different conflicts through the lens of the former Yugoslavia, but, in the conclusion, you turn to thinking about Syria and Sudan and Myanmar, the rationality of state actors of creating these either alliances or actually creating the groups in and of themselves in the beginning, it is very clear, to be able to have plausible deniability and to obscure the true origins of violence. This is not actually anything particularly new. If I think back to kind of work that I've done in Afghanistan, we've talked for years about the role of Pakistan using proxies in India and Afghanistan. And yet I kept returning to that point throughout your book, thinking, why are international policymakers and militaries so intent on seeing conflict and violence as dichotomous? State, non-state, good, bad, when the reality is that all types of, contemporary conflicts that I can think about are, by their very nature, complex. And it may be reassuring for some to think about things in kind of this kind of good, bad, state, non-state. But actually, it's not particularly helpful. And it is potentially very dangerous from a conflict resolution perspective. And I think, one of the key messages that you talked about throughout is just the need to kind of put forefront of people's mind to see that non-state actors can be used as a deliberate strategy, and they can be parallel to the state, but they might be being directed by it. And, in a way, the fact that we international community, international policymakers get distracted by looking at violence as irrational, saying, well, we don't understand it. It's driven by ethnic conflict. It's tribal violence. It's nothing to do with us. We can't understand it. It's a distraction, because, as you point out, there is a reason for violence. And ironically, if I think about the field of terrorism, we were, I think probably, back in the kind of 20, 30 years ago, we talked about terrorist violence as irrational and terrorists as madmen. That argument no longer stands. We very clearly see that there is a logic and a reason and a rationale behind terrorist violence. They strategically use violence. Why we're not able to kind of make that step for states, sort of surprises me. But it perhaps still goes down to this theme that you discuss as well, which is this Orientalism in the way that we approach dealing with conflicts. And even though I do not think, and you say yourself that it wasn't the same in Bosnia as we probably have in a post 9/11 world, but that sort of anxiety about Islamification, which was present, and how that impacted on foreign policy decisions, and that to me is what we see with CVE too. If we look at the roots of countering violent extremism policy, which were rooted in the war on terror, that Orientalism that it's imbued throughout, ultimately I think probably undermines a lot of countering violent extremism policy. And actually, it made me think, reading your book, the relevance of the kind of new way of dealing with things, which is this kind of CVE, PVE policy when it comes to complex conflicts. And people who know me on here, this isn't the first time I've said it. I work on terrorism and CVE, but I do always question the response we have today, particularly in complex conflicts. But I will just touch briefly on the criminal aspect, because I thought that was really important to emphasize. It does sometimes get ignored. And I wonder, in a way, if it's because we have a tendency to silo expertise. So you have, different spheres of kind of expertise dealing with different issues. But the key point that I think you made in the book, which was very important, which was that organized crime doesn't prevent activities from being framed or aligned to ideology, to a set of values, or to identity. And again, and I apologize for using the kind of Afghan reference, but I spent a long time there. I never really know whether we should describe the Taliban as a terrorist organization, an insurgent group, or a drugs mafia, because the reality is different individuals and different components of the group are all of those things. And actually much of the conflict that we see today, and historically, and a lot of the ethnic conflict that they've seen and the violations, are driven by issues that they've had for centuries, which are property, I think you said, and power. And ideology is simply the new framework in which old historic battles are being fought. At the same time, I think you made the point in your introduction just here about tackling that kind of the financial aspects to kind of cut off, I guess, the supply. And I would completely agree. I mean, I often wonder if you tackle in these countries some of the offenders, whether you would actually be also tackling the worst human rights abuses. Maybe it's easier to prove corruption than it is to prove the chain of command that we struggle in relation to the violence. And yet, I think my kind of final takeaway point before I throw a question at you is the point that Adam kind of introduced and you responded to, which is the lack of lessons learning is really getting somewhat distressing, because it is so clear throughout the reading the book and then the lessons in relation to other conflicts, and actually it's getting to the point of I guess my part A question would be really, what is the message that you want the book to give to international policymakers particularly? And then the kind of second one is a little bit more detailed, which is, and I'm going to kind of look at my notes, which is, you talked about the limitation of viewing interventions from the framework of fragility and conflict prevention, rather than a framework of preventing atrocities. And I think that makes sense. Yet, I can imagine the kind of comeback is, if conflicts are prevented, then there are fewer atrocities. So could you perhaps expand a little bit more on how you see the atrocity prevention framework kind of working better in terms of preventing atrocities?
Yeah, I'll take that one first, and then that will give me more time to answer this. I think the trickier one of sort of what do we want foreign policy decision makers to do differently. I think that there is a common assumption that mass atrocity crimes, and when we're talking about mass atrocity crimes, let's be really clear, that is genocide, that are crimes against humanity, it's war crimes, ethnic cleansing, sort of not legally defined, but also thrown in there. So it is a distinct kind of violence. And within that rubric, very often, and particularly in cases like Bosnia, they are identity-based mass atrocities, as in people are targeted because the perpetrators see some aspect of their victim's identity, and that is one of the motivations for why they're being targeted. And so that's different to say how armed conflict is recognized by the laws of war. Now, that is not me saying that we should be okay with legal war at all, but they are different kinds of phenomena. It is an assumption to assume that atrocities follow on from conflict. While many atrocities take place in the realm of armed conflict, they may be taking place side by side, or they may be driving the conflict. The assumption that they only take place in situations of armed conflict isn't true. You look at the case of Syria. Syria isn't an armed conflict where mass atrocities occur. It is an armed conflict that emerged out of patterns of, the deliberate targeting of civilians by that government, And that then perpetuated an armed conflict. But looking at what happened in Syria from a framework of conflict prevention didn't work. But you also have mass atrocities that occur outside in so-called peacetime or sort of cold contexts. Look at what's happening in Xinjiang. You know, almost certainly there is a, you know, I would be happy describing what's happening there as a genocide. And that is not in a situation of armed conflict. The situation in Rakhine, you know, where the Rohingya are still subject to appalling kind of vulnerabilities and violence. Some, if you take a very broad definition of conflict, would say that it's occurring in that context. I would say it's in parallel or distinct. And the reason really important is that the treatment of the Rohingya, the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the Bosnian Muslims in former Yugoslavia, was about discrimination and injustice. And that's the difference, right? Like that's what a framing of atrocity prevention centers prevention on. And so it's about who is included and who is excluded. And then that's not how peace negotiations, prevention response was applied to Bosnia. And we've got a little bit better in some contexts, but that's why it's so important. It looks at different root causes. We at Protection Approaches and a lot of my work, and this came out of the studying that I did for this book, use a frame of identity-based violence because it really roots it in the origins of where identity-based atrocities, and obviously not all atrocities are identity-based, come from and are rooted. So it almost forces your eyes into the injustice and the discrimination. And still now, most people, when they think of what happened in Bosnia in the 90s, don't think or don't know about the discrimination that accompanied it or foreshadowed it. So in the years before and the months before the violence broke out, you know, you had the Serbian authorities stripping the Muslims out of certain structures like the police, like the army, like the civil service. In certain cities and towns, you had behaviors that were reminiscent of the treatment of Jews and many, many other minority populations by the Nazis in the 1930s. So that's why I think that is important. The second question on sort of what I would like foreign policy decision makers to take away from the book. One is recognizing that these situations are complex in a different way to, I think, how they're often treated, but that doesn't inhibit action. It actually creates more opportunity for creative, I was going to say intervention, but that will then immediately be sort of taken for me to be thinking about armed action. And I'm not actually, I'm talking about sort of any contributions that could have a mitigating effect, like targeted sanctions, and really getting creative about what sanctions look like, really getting creative of working with different partners that are very willing to engage and stop smuggling across borders, but perhaps are less willing to be seen to be engaging on interfering in other states' issues around sovereignty and protecting populations. So I think that within that morass, there are actually many, many more opportunities. The other really important thing I hope that people will take away, particularly policymakers, is that non-state armed actors are so often used as a means of defense and protection. And that is a very difficult thing for us to think about, but it is a reality. And in Bosnia, it was an armed force that was a mess at first, that kind of really emerged spontaneously because it had to, in a really haphazard, pretty ineffective way. But those were forces that were protecting and saving lives. But they also committed some atrocities. And there was also kind of, then it became a situation of armed conflict. And so this isn't an easy thing for anyone to grapple with. But the assumption that you stick with the state and what the state says, whether they're denying responsibility for actors carrying out terrible atrocities in their name, or non-state armed groups that are trying to defend themselves from an aggressive or chauvinistic state, that's a really, really tricky one, but it's something that I have never seen discussed very much. I'll just caveat a tiny bit, but rarely discussed by those responding to these really complex situations.
Fascinating, great. Emily, do you want to add anything, or should?
I mean, I'll come back in a minute. I'm just conscious that a few questions have probably come up on the chat,
Great.
so to give some others some airtime.
Good, great. Yeah, I think, I mean, just to transition a bit to one of the questions, I think, Kate, when you describe often in one of the interesting conceptual moves that I think that you make in the book is you talk not just about this architecture of violence, but the logic of the violence. And one of the things that I think is coming out here that I find interesting is trying to think about what is the logic that governs some of the responses. And we're talking about prevention, we're talking about prevention, prevention, protection, and also prosecution, and the logic behind atrocity prevention versus protection of civilians versus prosecution is not always the same. Emily made the point of why is it that we often, in analyzing these contexts and thinking about how to respond, it's often, is it a conflict? Is it just random violence? Is it a non-state actor? Is it a state actor? And that determines how state authorities decide whether or not to respond. Much of that has to do with the legal system, right? With the laws of war and how international humanitarian law assigns responsibility within a certain context or not, which I think inhibits sometimes the best response, frankly. And I think that comes out in your work. We've got one question here from the Stanford Law School here from Beth Von Schock. And she asks, she'd be interested on your thoughts on whether the ICTY got the architecture of violence in the former Yugoslavia right in its jurisprudence. And I think it's a good question for you because there's actually quite a bit of that in the book. You've been through the jurisprudence quite a bit. So maybe could you articulate a little bit of that part of your argument?
And hi, Beth, thank you for joining. Yeah, did they get it right? What was very interesting for this writing this book is that I spent a lot of time kind of deep in the virtual archives of the ICTY, and 90%, no, maybe not that much, so much of the source material that I use comes from that archive, and it is so rich. And one of the stories that I wanted to tell was this story is out in the open. This is in publicly available evidence that was heard in an international tribunal. But the second part of that argument and why I had to write the story was because no one had put it together before, including, I think, the tribunal. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism of the tribunal because it's not their job to do. And I'm a historian and I was sort of knitting together something. There were some really important breakthroughs, I think, that the ICTY made in identifying kind of they would be more likely to use the language of a joint criminal enterprise, but then that also fell out of favor a little bit later. But that came from prosecuting, jurisprudence in domestic legal frameworks of prosecuting structures of organized crime. So there's actually a legal parallel there. And to my mind, when that framework was used, and I need to be careful because I'm sure there are some people with many kind of legal backgrounds on this call, and I am not a legal scholar, even though I deign to kind of challenge some of the loopholes within the legal profession or like the international prosecution space. But I think that some of those cases where that framing of a joint criminal enterprise, they succeeded most in demonstrating chains of command. What was really clear, though, and this is not a criticism either of the ICTY or the process, but you necessarily have to have a paper trail in order to, prove culpability and responsibility. And the threshold for establishing that is much lower than a historian as it is, in a court of law. And obviously the whole process of prosecution and that strategy of prosecution is to find where the arguments and the evidence that will stick, and establishing a kind of narrative of that chain of responsibility is more like a culture of violence than it is something that is easy to prove. And I think that it's something that is still a struggle for prosecutions in international tribunals and the International Criminal Court, it's a really difficult thing to recognize that where there is most evidence is often at the sharp end of the violence. You know, these foot soldiers who commit the violence, you know, they are the ones that sort of hold the machete, that hold the machine gun, that commit these very, very visceral and violent acts. But whether they are the ones that hold the greatest responsibility is a very difficult question for a court of law, because it almost comes of one of kind of interpretation, even maybe of morality and kind of philosophy of kind of where guilt lies and what guilt looks like. And some of that will never be able to be done in a court. But there were also relationships that I think really could have been exposed. And I think that there was no intentionality throughout the ICTY's existence to tell a story of how joined up it was. And there was a focus on the state-led structures where they were most able to prove, or individuals that were much more explicitly responsible for violence. So a lot of people fell through the gaps. And as is so often the case, the ones that really fell through the gaps were the middle managers, which is a phrase that the journalist Ed Vulliamy used to sort of describe these middle managers of genocide. They're bureaucrats. And of course, you know, Hannah Arendt talks much more eloquently than I shall ever attempt to do so. But the kind of bureaucratic structures that enabled this violence, I don't think were ever really prosecuted. So I think that was where the real gap in the ICTY was. And we'll see as kind of the International Criminal Court evolves, whether that is a loophole that can be closed. The last thing I'll say on it is that what I really think that I took away from looking at the experience of the ICTY was that I was struck by the extent to which state leaderships and politicians got away with it. And there were a number of prosecutions successful, but there were also a number of those leaders that got away or got sentences commuted and, you know, sort of did 8 years or so for genocide and then went home. And I think that what that legal experience, important and groundbreaking though it was, demonstrated was that if you could successfully devolve responsibility or visible responsibility and perpetration of mass violence to others, you would successfully get away with it. And there's something about our state-centered approach of our responsibilities towards populations that are not within our own borders that will perpetuate that, because states want to have good standing. Even the most chauvinist and the most appalling generally want to kind of still participate at some level in our global world. And no one really benefits from being seen as a genocidal state. That's why states deny it. And I think that that gap in advocacy and in prosecution and in politics is something that really needs to be interrogated, because the ICTY was unable to kind of bridge that gap.
Isn't that kind of why they say that ISIS was the best thing that could have happened to Assad?
Yeah.
You know, it actually made him, you know, the myopic focus that resulted, you know, once you had this kind of ISIS foothold in Syria and Iraq, the myopic focus on that propelled Assad into this kind of, you know, international darling almost, because he was then the one, you know, resisting the, you know, the overwhelming of ISIS. And that narrative actually now is very hard. It's very hard to remember 2012. And, you know, the debates that we were having in 2011, 2012 in terms of how to deal with Syria. And that, you know, is a direct result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
There's this response actually has good segues to two of the additional questions that we have. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order, but I'll give you them both and you can respond. So we've only got about 15 minutes left. I think there's an important part of the book and an argument that we've kind of touched upon a bit about how we analyze this violence informs how the international community responds to this violence. And the story about Assad is just sort of relevant to that. Nicola Weindorp takes issue with something that I said, but I don't. This is not. I'm not making these arguments, but suggesting that the reason governments don't engage is because of the framing of the law and how that applies. She says, isn't it more about political calculations, about risk and relevance? And that's why Kate and Emily's work is so important, to help politicians understand and judge correctly the risk of failing to prevent atrocities and to move more quickly and effectively to collaborate to tackle situations as they escalate. So if I could just rephrase that as a question, is in this work, could you say a little bit more about how we we should understand this work? I mean, this violence in a way to help decision makers defend the need to do something, to take action, because so often when the complexity is such, decision makers say, well, there's nothing we can do, we can't take action, it's too complicated, the accountability, who, as you started out with your point about Tim Judah, it's a moot point because we don't know. And then on the organized crime point, you made a good point about the ICTY and its success in framing a joint criminal enterprise as one of the ways in which they found success. And that makes the connection between organized crime and accountability. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the relationship between organized crime and the actual identity-based violence itself on the ground. Tristan Riley Smith from the University of Cambridge says, you mentioned the part that organized crime played in the Myanmar atrocities against the Rohingya. Could you unpack that for us? And are there broader lessons for us about the relationship between identity-based violence and organized crime? And one further point I would put on that is there a something specific to organized crime and identity-based violence? Because you see quite mass violence related to organized crime that is not necessarily identity-based. I'm thinking in Mexico and maybe Colombia and such. But what is the connection there with the identity-based violence, if you can?
They're such good questions and they're so rich, and I probably will not do them justice. But thank you, Tristram and Nicola, for both of them. I'll reverse it. I'll take the first one, the second one first, so I don't forget either. I think that's a really good point. Is there something particular about organized crime and identity-based violence versus organized crime and violence? And the answer, I think, is yes and no. There's something about organized crime and profit, and there is a lot of profit to be made in all sort of unstable contexts where impunity flourishes, bad governance flourishes, and essentially you can sort of do the things that you can't do in stable, well-governed contexts. So in that sense, no. But there is something, a special dynamic, I think, that does exist in identity-based violence. And here I actually don't just mean mass violence and atrocities. Wherever there is structural injustice and discrimination, people are profiting from those that are excluded. And that is as true in the UK and in the US, you know, where you have structural discrimination and there are people who are marginalized and excluded, whether for historic reasons, but is rooted in aspects of their identity, whether that is race or religion or gender, whether that is, you know, whether they have disabilities, for whatever reason that might be, there is a profit that is made on the back of that exclusion. Now, that's not the same as organized crime. Maybe in some contexts, it comes close to corruption though, you know, in some parts of the world. In contexts of identity-based mass violence and of genocide, ethnic cleansing, you know, Karadzic himself is kind of credited with giving us this term and concept. But it is the very act of removing a group from an area of land. And so embedded in that is the kind of profit that, you know, the perpetrators profit from that removal. They get that land. And so embedded in the logic of genocide is a a kind of divesting of power and of property. And that is very, very attractive for those that are involved in kind of organized crime and structures. Now, what I think you see, particularly in the case of former Yugoslavia, is where it's very often the same actors. You have this devolved structure of violence, which means it's very often the same actors that are committing the mass atrocities and then profiting on the side. And what I find interesting is that those non-state actors / paramilitaries / organized criminal experts, the closer they were to the center of power, the less likely they were to directly take that property themselves, but they would profit in much greater ways through political gifts, through greater influence, through being given media stations and so on. Whereas the more localized those groups were, their profits would be things like televisions, jewelry, maybe someone's house, things like that. So I do think there is a special dynamic there. Nicola's question around, which I think is it's around political will versus the legal structures, and sort of essentially like, why is it that states don't do more? I actually think that it's both. I think that what I try and unpack in this book, and I suppose, as Nicola will probably know, sort of in the work that I do more broadly, is unpacking like the reasons why governments give for not doing more. And I'm not naive, right? Like, it's not that if only the UK government, or if only the French government, or any government, if they only knew more, then they would do more. But there is something powerful of stripping away some of those excuses. And I do think that, which I think perhaps was your point, Adam, but correct me if I'm wrong, was that policymakers are able to fall back on those legal frameworks as an excuse for not doing better. And I think obviously I think that we must respect our laws. And maybe we could do more of that in many places of in the world, including the UK right now. But within that can be some kind of problems. We spend a long time talking about the definitions of violence. Is it genocide or isn't it? When if it's demonstrably a kind of crime against humanity, that whether it's genocide or not should not be the trigger of whether the UK does more or doesn't. Also in history, it has never triggered more action, whether it was or was not. So in that sense, the legal bit is there and it does inhibit. But I do also think Nicola is right in kind of really pointing to that political will, because without the political will, there is no action. And I think that's the kind of knot we're all trying to untangle, and there isn't an easy one. And I suppose that this book is maybe, I do say like it sits unapologetically between kind of research and advocacy, but it's maybe me in a more muted advocacy voice than maybe I otherwise sometimes am. That kind of felt like dodging the question. Sorry, Nicola.
No, that's great. It's a complicated question, and I certainly don't want to be. I don't want people to come away from this being like, "Oh, Lupel is against international law." That's not the case. I think that it depends. It really, I think, part of the question is to in what part of the law do we address these issues, right? Because our understanding of conflict dynamics is advancing, and armed conflict is changing, is transforming, and the kinds of violence and the intersecting of them is changing, and our legal instruments and our legal strategies have to evolve with them as well. Great. We've on our scheduled time, we've got about 5 minutes. Are we allowed to go a little bit over? Can we've got a couple more questions.
We can see people might need to drop.
Okay, because there's one question here that I think maybe might bring Emily more into the back into the conversation, which I think would be great. And this is from Shireen McCarthy of ODI, and she asked, you mentioned tracing and cutting off financial flows as a channel through which atrocities can be prevented. What are your thoughts on the adverse effects of counterterrorism and anti-money laundering regulations that could end up causing more harm than good. Bank de-risking, for example, continues to be discriminatory, and conflict affected at heart and in practice with Muslims, and conflict affected contexts being more affected than others. How can we find that balance? And I think that we see that also in sanctions regimes and in impeding humanitarian interventions and such. And I'm wondering, I don't know if should we kick that to Emily first, and then let's kick that.
I want to hear what Emily says about that.
Yeah, do you know, it's such a good point, because we know the harm that anti-money laundering regulations have done. And, you know, I would add to that list of kind of Muslim and conflict affected contexts, but specifically to women, because actually women's groups as smaller organizations are often ones which have not met the new, you know, higher level of regulation compliance that's needed and are being deprived of funding, therefore. So I completely take, I think we both would take, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, Kate, but the point that, you know, you do need to be very sensitive when you look at using finance, I guess, as a stick to beat people with. And I think that's where we did actually a research piece on this a few years ago at RUSI. And I remember one of the recommendations was, rather than applying sort of national measures, is there a way of being far more strategic in where you cut the funding streams off at? So in many cases, and I mean, if I think to the Afghan context, in terms of people who were responsible for a massacre called Afshar, which is, you know, one of the worst massacres during the Civil War, which has gone completely unpunished because they have not had any form of criminal tribunal. But, you know, the perpetrators of that are still very much in senior levels of government positions, have money, have power, have resources. Is there a way of saying, okay, you cannot travel outside Afghanistan? Is there a way of saying the children of people who are committing these crimes cannot go and study overseas in the US, in America? Because, you know, we need to be a bit more clever and targeted, I think, in the way we use finances. There was one other point I was going to make, but I've forgotten it. So I'll let Kate respond, and then I might remember it in the meantime.
Yeah, really good and important question. I suppose what comes to mind when I was sort of listening to both the question and as Emily was talking is, I think one of the things that the world learned from the situation of former Yugoslavia in the early 90s was how catastrophic bad sanctions could be, and the impact of the blanket sanctions that were levied on Serbia are still being felt. They were absolutely devastating. You know, it's a form of collective punishment, and I think that we need to be really careful when we're talking about sort of financial instruments and sanctions. And we are really going towards an area, and certainly in the UK, I think it's that there is an opportunity here to kind of think about what the UK's new sanction regime could look like, because devastated as we are that we've now left the European Union, it does mean that the UK can now control its own sanctions policy. And the EU has always had a very slow sanctions regime and kind of not a very creative one. I do think, though, that we need to really recognise how bespoke they have to be. You know, if we think about the situation in Myanmar, actually those very targeted sanctions of banning travel, freezing assets, they don't work because it's a very, very closed country, and the Tatmadaw leadership don't have assets or interests elsewhere. They don't holiday in Paris like, you know, sort of the oligarchs of Russia do. They're not interested. So it kind of effectively has very limited impact. So there, you know, advocates are calling for the freezing and the, you know, sanctions on the financial assets within the country related to the military leadership. And so that's kind of what I was talking about. Sort of you map out where the money is and who's in charge and what you need to cut off. And I do think that that's something that could be really leveraged creatively and is a non-violent approach. The other thing I think that's really important is that at the moment, sanctions regimes, especially in the United Kingdom, are not currently tied to thinking about prevention, particularly of conflict and atrocity violence. And so we don't have, those of you that, you know, on this call that sort of know protection approaches work will go, here she goes. But we don't have a national strategy of atrocity prevention in this country. And if we did, if we had a coordinated mechanism or unit sat within Whitehall that could coordinate and be responsible for talking to the Treasury when you're talking about applying sanctions, talking to the Foreign Office, the Development Office, talking to New York, coordinating where those points of leverage are, looking at the financial instruments that the UK has at its disposal, like chasing the profits of genocide from the City of London. That is all prevention mechanisms. There's a rich toolbox there, but unless you've got the expertise to do that mapping, do that prevention thinking, understanding the dynamics of mass atrocity violence, then you're simply going to miss stuff. So, you know, I think rich avenue of prevention tools, but you need to integrate it into the thinking of what prevention means and looks like.
Great, thanks. Very, very good, Kate. We're just about out of time, but there's one more question that I think I would like to just sort of rephrase a little bit to ask, and then you can take that as an opportunity to answer and then give any final closing remarks. One thing I should say is that if you should look at the chat, because I've been reading the questions, but editing out all the, this is fascinating, this is brilliant, you're incredible, Kate, and all that. So that's that should be said. There's a question here from Chris Blacktop. He doesn't. I'm not sure where from, but I think it's important in one sense. He asked how you would describe Israel's approach to the Palestinians, in particular in the potential use of military proxies. And actually, I mean, you can, if you want to choose to address the Israel-Palestinian question, but I think the proxy question is actually really interesting for the contemporary context writ large, because, you know, one thing that we haven't really unpacked in this conversation is at the core of the book is your analysis of the distinctions between regular and irregular forces and how they operated within the Balkans. Today, a lot of that also adds an additional very complicated element, and that is proxy forces, international proxy forces, and trying to unpack the accountability with those forces added into the mix creates a whole another level of complexity. So how does, whether in the Israel-Palestinian context or the broader context, how do you see the presence of proxy forces complicating or factoring into your analysis on all these issues? I mean, and then any final
sure. I mean, it's a great question, and I'm not dodging it, and it's not just because it's the end of the our time together. I think the simple answer is I really see that situation of the use of proxy combatants by Israel and anywhere as part of what I'm talking about in this book. To me, that is part of the parcel, this sense of devolving perpetration of crimes and perceived responsibility, visual responsibility for those crimes is a tactic that we are seeing more and more, and we don't yet have a full answer to it because it's powerful and it works. States know that if they can devolve the commission of targeting civilians, targeting populations for who they are, away from that state, then they are likely to get away with it. We don't have a legal framework that is effective enough to respond. We don't have a political framework that is effective to respond, because unfortunately, and maybe this goes to Nicola's point earlier around the importance of political will, the deniability, the plausible deniability creates enough space for the rest of the community, the global community, to do nothing. And it makes it harder to prosecute, it makes it harder to demonstrate, it makes those uncomfortable decisions that policymakers must get better at making avoidable, and they shouldn't be avoidable. And I think, you know, the case of Israel and Palestine is a very good one of that, because it is a difficult issue that policymakers in the UK, for example, want to avoid, and the plausible deniability makes it easier. So I hope that's not cutting an answer to kind of a really important question short, but essentially I see it as part of what I'm trying to grapple with, and I hope more will try and grapple with. I'm conscious that we're a little bit over time, so maybe I will just say my thanks and then hand over to you, Adam. I'm just so overwhelmed by how kind and generous people have been in getting this book out, in their advice around the book, around the work I was doing, as it took so many years to get the book out, and setting up protection approaches more generally. I just feel so extraordinarily lucky to work in a sector that is full of such generous and brilliant people. And I don't take that for granted. And I know we've lost some of the people that were on this call, probably mostly those that have to rush off to meetings, because I know how busy everyone is. But there are so many names here that I can see on my screen that I'm just so grateful for. Far too many that I could name in the book, far too many that I can name now. So just let me take this moment now to say thank you so much. I appreciate you, and this book and none of the work that I do or Protection Approaches does would be possible without that support. And thank you, Adam and Emily. I'm so thrilled that you took up the invitation to do this, and for your very, very generous words about this book and giving your time. And I'm just delighted, and thank you, everyone. Really full of sort of love and appreciation.
Wonderful, thank you. This has been really, really a very rich discussion, and if for those who have not read the book, I think that we've only scratched the surface in many ways. There's so much here. So congratulations again. I wish we could. We didn't get the wine and cheese, but we also don't get the after discussion pint, which is so hopefully we'll get that at some point. And then thank you, Emily. It was really, really wonderful to have you, and best of luck. And I hope that you get to discuss this book further far and wide, and that it's read by people of influence, because it should be. Great. Thank you so much.
So much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.